Great. Let's jump in. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Ali Matroni, Director of Client Experience at Align. If you are new to the Align community, it's nice to meet you. And if you're not new, hello, nice to see you. We are an impact investing advisory firm that partners with families, individual investors, and foundations to clarify their values and then align their portfolios with those values. We look at opportunities across asset classes and impact sectors, everything from food systems to financial inclusion. And we look not just at what we're helping our clients invest in or who we're helping them invest in, but also at who is building wealth through the investments that we're recommending at Align. Which brings me to our event today, where we will explore shared ownership structures, policy, and how LPs can invest in these types of structures. I'm super excited about this discussion because shared ownership can have a direct impact on the growing wealth gap in the US, and because our speakers are some of the most thoughtful leaders innovating in this space. I'm also excited about this because I'm hopeful that as we continue to innovate structurally and policy-wise, it encourages the impact investing community, our community, to push past representation and continue to think about ownership and wealth building in new ways. Okay, I'm done. As our speakers know, I could talk about this all day. Instead, I will pass it over to the experts. Jen Ketting, CEO of Align, will be moderating our panel that features Smitha Das at World Education Services, Jack Moriarty of Ownership America, and Phil Reeves over at APIS and Heritage Capital Partners. Jen, I'll pass it over to you, but to kick us off, I'd love for you to maybe start with sharing why you feel personally drawn to this conversation. And if people have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, and I'll be managing that when we get to the Q&A portion of our event today.
Thank you so much, Ali. Thank you for your extraordinary leadership and your passion and for your continued partnership. I also want to thank our clients, our friends of the community, and our team, as well as the broader ecosystem for joining us today. It does take a village, and it's super important that we have this conversation and continue to have this conversation. The reason that Align wanted to showcase this conversation is it's something that we've been working on personally over the last 15 to 24 months in the strategic direction of our organization. As we move forward, we're looking beyond just how we invest and who we invest in and what we invest in, but also changing the face of finance. It is Align's commitment, which you'll hear more about later this month and in the coming quarters, to remain independent and to put our people and our clients first inside of an ever-expanding ecosystem. And I'm really proud to say that we just made 3 women also equity owners in the business, Ali being one of them, Gianna and Ishita. And it's our commitment that our employees over time continue to be a large stakeholder in this business, and that we drive the ownership beyond just our investors and our clients, but to the broader ecosystem of the future leaders of this ecosystem. So today, Align is 30% of its employees actually have some type of ownership. And we own more than 50% of the company, and will continue to expand that in the years to come. And I think it's super important because shifting of income and shifting of opportunity is one aspect of the conversation, but really shifting and building wealth is another huge piece of shifting the dynamics, not only in America, but across the globe. So these speakers are very talented, and this is part of their life's work, which we're going to dive into here for the next 35 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. I also want to give a shout out to one of our clients. Hopefully she doesn't shy away that I'm going to put her on the spot, but Amy Brakeman has been driving this conversation for more than the past year or two, but really spearheading it from every facet of the things that she does with her time, her energy, her treasures, and her capital. And so I really want to acknowledge her for pushing us and being part of the Align family. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our extraordinary panelists. I'm actually going to ask Phil to go first. Will you share with us why you do this work and what drew you to shared ownership in the first place?
Sure. So I'm super excited to be here. This feels like a family conversation. You guys, Jack, Smith, the investors. So really excited to meet everyone. So I'm Phil Reeves with APIS and Heritage Capital Partners. We're an impact private equity firm based in Washington, D.C. And our mission is to use employee ownership to close the racial wealth gap. And so the way we go about that is looking for great small businesses all around the country that have workers of color, and then converting those businesses from being, instead of owned by a family or a single person, being owned by the employees, much like the journey Align's on. And we believe that through that work, we get an opportunity to allow people, in regular working type jobs, we call it the real economy, plumbing, landscaping, food processing, letting those folks get an opportunity to build real wealth. And so, Jen, to your question around sort of what draws me to that work, it's that story. I think, I've been fortunate to spend time in sort of the Black business community here in DC, and you meet folks who they've built great companies, and they've done, their family's on a great path, their kids go to the best schools, they're in the best neighborhoods, the whole deal, but they beat so many odds to do that. And I think the way we look at it is it shouldn't be that hard to have a good retirement and to sort of live the American dream. And so we think employee ownership helps to kind of bring that idea back. And it's been working for 50 plus years. We're just aiming it at the communities that need it most.
Well, thank you for that, and look forward to diving in further with you. Jack, you want to share with us kind of what drives you and where you come at it from in this conversation?
Absolutely. Well, Jen, thank you so much for having me, and Allie and the entire Align team. It's so important to have these kinds of discussions. I'm grateful to be here. I'm Jack Moriarty. I'm the founder and executive director of a small think tank public policy organization called Ownership America. And our mission is to accelerate the growth of broad-based ownership and essentially turn Americans into owners and create wealth and opportunity as a result of that. And to answer your question, Jen, about 5 or 6 years ago, I was getting ready to go to business school. I was looking for, what are some solutions to how we address questions of economic disparity and opportunity. And I found, to your earlier comments, that the conversation was importantly focused on issues of income and wealth and wages and so forth. But this wealth piece was really absent, and I thought conspicuously so. And as I sort of fortuitously stumbled upon employee ownership, got to know the field and started talking to employee owners and companies and even investors, it really struck me that this is something that's enormously powerful. It's not a new idea, although it's been, I think, peripheral, both in the economy, it's been peripheral in our policy discourse. I think that's both starting to change, but it is rare to have an issue that is both bipartisan. It is empirically demonstrated to be successful. We know that it works, and yet there's still so much work and growth and potential ahead of us. A rare confluence of both impact and political assets, if you will. And so I thought we really need to scale this up, build a movement, and really get serious about what are the kinds of policies that we can really enable this field to grow and scale. And that's really where I intend to slot in with Ownership America.
Great. Yeah, oftentimes in these conversations, we leave out policy. So I'm really excited that you're here to complement us and actually share what's going on in recent legislation. So with that, last but certainly not least, Smitha from WES, share with us why you do this work, some of your work, and then I'd love to dive in with the first question for you.
Thanks, Jen, and thanks, Allie, for the invitation. It's great to be with you all today. I'm Smitha, and I oversee mission and impact investing at World Education Services, or WES. We are a social enterprise with a mission to advance economic, social inclusion for immigrants, refugees, and communities of color. And so particularly within our impact investments, we're focused on 4 themes: advancing economic opportunity, wealth, power, and justice. And particularly as we thought about the wealth theme for us and building out that investment thesis, we really were just thinking about how have individuals been able to build intergenerational wealth over time. And as you think about it, it really is through asset ownership. Owning your own home, owning your own business are really the traditional paths to build intergenerational wealth. So how do we think about unlocking access to asset ownership and shared ownership, not just increasing wages? And that's really the thesis across our portfolio as we think about the variety of different assets one can own and trying to democratize access.
Great. Let's dive in there. Can you kind of showcase what types of shared ownership structures exist today? And I know you're going to do so visually for our visual learners, and dive into kind of some of the thought that went behind looking at these different structures.
Absolutely. So let me share my screen. We partner really closely with several other investors in this space, one of which is the Gary team at Gary Community Ventures. So we've been working with them to build out this framework, a pyramid of ownership. And as we think about the multiple types of assets one can own, that's essentially how the pyramid is structured. So at the top, you could think about just individual financial assets. So we've made investments in our portfolio that are helping particularly immigrants and refugees with little to no credit get access to some of our financial systems and in markets, right? Individuals who have been typically locked out of our system. Then we think about home ownership. So we've made a couple deals here. You'll see the logos on the right, Deerfield Fund and Black Star Stability, types of investments that are increasing access to home ownership through down payment assistance, by restructuring non-performing loans. There's other models out there as well around community land trusts. And so you can also imagine that some of these pieces of the pyramid sometimes blend, and we're okay with that. Employee ownership. So between Jack and Phil, we have a lot of experts in the room, Amy as well, but we've made several investments here, 2 more actually to announce this week. So Apis and Heritage with Phil's team. We've also supported Project Equity, Common Trust, and the latest is Obron, but really just thinking about how can we increase access to worker ownership. And there's multiple different structures out there. There's an ESOP, an employee stock option plan. And then you could think about employee ownership trusts, EOTs, worker cooperatives. There's blends across these. I think the ANH team has a really great model that I've been hearing the word ESOPerative in the space. So kind of a blend between a co-op and an ESOP. And so we're seeing a lot of different structures. We're at West trying to plant many seeds and learn across all these different types of structures and really understand which are best equipped to not only increase wealth, but also democratize power and worker voice. So we're particularly interested in those models at the intersection of work, wealth, and power. Tenant equity. So our friends at Gary have supported the Colorado Housing Accelerator Initiative. We're still looking into some tenant equity vehicles at West and are excited to dig deeper into that thesis in the new year. And community ownership. So these are 2 deals on the horizon for us, but we're starting to get into real estate, a very different asset class for us at West, and trying to understand how we can think about community owned real estate and those emerging models in the space. And so this is the framework that's been helpful for us. We're writing up a piece right now with the Gary team to share this with the field, but feel free to run with it. We want to really open source this if it's helpful.
Yeah, I want to commend you for open sourcing it and sharing the framework off, and find that as investors, we tend to develop our own frameworks and then we have too many in the ecosystem. So thanks for being a leader in that respect. We'll come back to kind of how do you implement these strategies inside of a portfolio shortly here. Philip, I want to turn the conversation to you around why does ownership matter? And I'd also love for you to address not only ownership, but power and the shifting of power inside of the racial and gender equity conversation that we're having, not only in the US, but globally.
No, absolutely. I think, I think the points are clear, right? So the society that I think we all sort of sit in, ownership seems to be the key to everything. Owning homes, owning assets, owning real estate, that's sort of the security blanket that I think a lot of folks have, but a lot of folks don't, unfortunately. And so if you can get those assets and give that opportunity to people, I think that's the big thing. That's our big sort of philosophy of it is we're trying to enable people to have the opportunity to accrue assets in a way that's accessible. You hear a lot of people like, oh, we need to do, we need more startups, more entrepreneurship. That's not accessible for a lot of folks. Like if you're kind of laden down with college debt, or you don't have a family, an early round from wealthy family members, that's hard. But you could hopefully, in like the construct I think we all hope comes to fruition, you could live in a home that was, help supported by an opportunity like Deerfield, and, go to a job where you have a stake, and that we think that's just a better way to build a society. To your point, the racial element, I think, is key. Employee ownership, as I said earlier, been around for 50 years. I actually met a guy one time who, like there's a company Jack and I know about. They have 45 millionaires in their company. These are employees in their company, and they're millionaires because of their ownership stake in the business. But how many of those millionaires were people of color? And it's just not a high number. And it's because these kind of opportunities, like you hear about employee ownership, and everyone's like, oh, it's an architectural firm, or it's people use it all the time in the VC space, like, oh, it's a tech startup. And I think our lens is, well, what if it's a trash hauler? What if it's an electrician? What if it's a commercial cleaner? What if it's the nurse coming to take care of your elderly parents? Same opportunity set. And so when you put a racial lens on it, we think it just has more impact and gives a more just world.
Yeah, it reminds me of these are the jobs that actually run our society.
Yeah.
So we should reward them not only with, incomes that allow them to continue to thrive in society, but also support generations of their family beyond. So thank you.
And they're really good investments as well.
Exactly. All right, Jack, let's turn it to policy. Oftentimes we leave policy out, but it actually does play a critical role in a lot of different things inside of investing, and just kind of really how we operate as a investment ecosystem and in general in society. Can you share kind of where we are as it relates to policy, and really dive into the Employee Equity Investment Act, maybe at a simplistic way, just because we have different viewers and different perspectives on this call?
Well, Jen, I'm so thrilled that you did elect to integrate policy in this conversation, because I think when you look at how do you align a portfolio for maximum impact, of course, is the aligned mission and your core competencies and expertise. What I have found, generally speaking, is sometimes policy gets left out. And when you think about it, in my view, policy is the tool that is synergistic with an aligned impact portfolio. If you don't have policy that is moving in the same direction, that is specifically designed to enhance scale, advantage and impact oriented portfolio, then there will be a ceiling on that scale. And so, fundamentally, markets and capital markets included are boiled down to policy choices. What kinds of investment strategies will be highly rewarding and have competitive return profiles, and what strategies won't. I'll say at a high level, this Employee Equity Investment Act, which is a piece of bipartisan legislation that was introduced in Congress a couple of months ago, we advised on it and others, it's fundamentally designed to make an employee ownership investment strategy more attractive to more investors, and to really catalyze the number of funds that are operating in this market, the size of those funds, and the return profile of those funds. And so APIS and Heritage is one fabulous example. You can probably count on one or two hands the amount of funds that are out there doing this work. And so, we need to really put our thumb on the scale and say, we need to really speed this up. One specific problem that the bill is designed to solve is that, and Phil is an expert in this, but most sellers, when they choose to go employee ownership as a succession option, whether that's an ESOP or a worker cooperative, it's a shared problem. And there's certainly other strategies that are important. But with those two strategies, most sellers are financing a significant part of the transaction themselves. They're taking back a long-term subordinated seller's note, and they're getting paid out gradually. And that's been successful for sellers that have that appetite, and that's excellent. But it has left out a much wider swath of sellers that want their liquidity at close. And even if they intrinsically see the value in preserving the legacy of their business and taking care of their employees, they view this seller financing arrangement as unappealing and even prohibitive. And so, what a fund like Apis and Heritage does, without getting too far into Phil's territory here, is it solves that problem, because they are functionally behaving like a traditional financial buyer. They are providing that liquidity, and as a result, employee ownership can be a much more viable and competitive option vis-a-vis other options that may not be as powerful for workers and communities by extension. So we've recruited an unusual bedfellows of coalition partners. We've got Senator Chris Van Hollen working with Senator Marco Rubio, Senator Tammy Baldwin, Senator Todd Young out of Indiana, a great group of bipartisan lead sponsors in the House as well, even number of Democrats and Republicans. And so I think it's such a powerful example of there is an appetite, even in Congress. I know we think in a lot of ways things are very polarized, and that's real, but there are opportunities to move the needle on things that are very powerful, and employee ownership happens to be one of those issues that has a lot of bipartisan support. And if we can move capital markets in the direction of saying, well, not only can we be competitive with sellers, but we're going to have a much more competitive return profile as well, which is really, it's effectively a subsidy of a fund strategy that's using employee ownership, then that really is our theory of change of how we take public policy to scale impact investing.
Love it. Super needed. And I'm glad that we have some hope in the conversation and that we have something that we agree on at a government level. We'll circle back to diving in a little bit further on the policy side and maybe some of the challenges shortly here. I want to bring it back to Smitha. I want you to, sometimes we have these conversations and people are like, this all sounds great, but how do I actually integrate it into my portfolio? Or for Align, how do we as advisors not only educate our clients, but work with them to be able to integrate all of these factors into building a portfolio? Can you share a little bit about how you use the pyramid as well as kind of your thesis in building out the West portfolio to date?
Absolutely. I mean, I think first and foremost, we consider ownership and shared ownership as a lens across our portfolio. So not necessarily a specific allocation that we have, or we don't consider it necessarily a specific asset class, because as we look at the types of investments across that pyramid, some of those investments are in commercial real estate, some are in mezzanine debt, some are in private equity. So really, it's more of a thematic or a lens across our portfolio, and even a pretty diverse set of types of investments. We do LP equity investments like we have with the Apis and Heritage team. We've also explored several direct investment opportunities direct into cooperatives and supporting those transitions. We've also looked at innovative financing structures. It's not always debt and equity. Sometimes it's even through other models like a dividend model, or non-voting preferred stock is now in some ways a preferred path to invest in a cooperative than say just through debt. And so there's different types of investments one can make. There's also different asset classes one can make this in. So I think just making sure that shared ownership, if you have a wealth building, if you have a power sharing theme, if you have a racial equity theme, I think this work of shared ownership is so multifaceted that depending on what your impact goals are, there's so many impacts to be had with this work. And so you could it kind of meets you where you are. So I've worked with a lot of different family offices and foundations that are really coming to this specifically from we want a democratic governance. So we really want to focus on something like an employee ownership trust or perpetual purpose trust, or also looking at cooperative models in those democratic governance structures, and that's their entry point. There's others who are more focused on the wealth building piece, and there's others that are more focused on just a specific racial or JEDI focus, justice, equity, diversity, inclusion. There's others that are just interested in innovative finance. And so I think it really depends on what your goals are, but given the breadth of investment opportunities here and the pyramid is quite broad, you could probably find a place to join the movement.
And I want to dig in a little bit deeper. When you think about, if we go beyond asset classes or financial returns or even impact returns, how do you look at it from a shifting of power and inside of what we can and can't do today inside of your own due diligence process? So maybe some of the other things that maybe don't jump out right away.
Yeah, well, I mean, particularly, I think probably Phil could give a really good example of how they aren't just doing a traditional ESOP. They're taking principles from the cooperative model to really think about shared governance of the organization and how that actually has additional impacts in addition to the wealth building piece. And so there's models like that that really energize us. I wouldn't say at Wes we're interested in maybe just a pure play ESOP, but there's others out there who would certainly invest in that. So I think it kind of depends on what your focus are. So we're always looking at what's the worker voice piece, what is the governance structure, and where are frontline, particularly frontline workers, involved in the governance of the organization. And there's a lot of innovations we're excited about. Common Trust is a new fund. We're going to be joining the first close next month. But they just started a new fund called Groundwork. And that's just yet another investment opportunity that's using a unique approach of a perpetual purpose trust. This is in the news recently because last year Patagonia exited as a employee ownership trust. So it kind of put that structure on the map, but there's a lot of different ways to structure an EOT. It's relatively nascent concept in the US, much more established in the UK and across the world. And so we're in some ways taking a lot of watching how the rest of the world is doing it and looking to people like Jack on how can we build out the policy landscape and infrastructure around these new structures like EOTs to enable them to scale.
Great. Well, it sounds like we can have a follow-up webinar, dig in even further. Phil, I want to come back to you. I want to really focus on you as a practitioner. What are the challenges that you've seen or experienced consistently around implementing these types of structures, either in your own structure and or with the underlying portfolio companies and companies you're working with?
So I think it's a great question. I think the first set of challenges are really in like to Jack's point, or the capital markets point. So this whole conversation around employee ownership, shared ownership structures, all of this is very new. And so for the traditional capital, like even like that slide Smith put up, all the vast majority of those funds this is their first fund. And so for a lot of investors, it's unfortunate, but like the big institutions, pension funds, insurance companies, they can't execute on a first-time fund. They certainly can't execute on a first-time fund that's doing a strategy that's really, really nascent and like regardless of structure. And so it really is incumbent on foundations, family offices, individuals to sort of help spur this movement we're creating. Because if we can't get these sort of models in the wild and get these teams operating, then you'll never see this scale up, to Jack's point. I mean, I think Jack is, if you think about like Smith's work, it's like, okay, we're at the early stage, we're getting folks started. Jack's helping folks sort of bridge to the middle. And then I think what we all hope to see is then the capital markets take over and you can theoretically, you can get this through your 401k, or someone has a public traded vehicle that does this stuff. And I think that's the paradigm we're trying to get to. And so I think the first challenge was just getting investors up to speed on all this. I mean, you can probably hear just in our own commentary, like it gets wonky and complicated, and it's a curve that folks have to get over. But individuals and small foundations can, institutions, some of them never will. On the execution side, I mean, executing these transactions is, has its own twists and turns. It's just M&A, which is always, and then small business M&A is just its own curveballs. And so a lot of it is, if you think about like, especially that word ESOP, people have like some bad connotations. They're like, oh, United Airlines, that was a terrible ESOP. Tribune, that was a terrible ESOP. And so a lot of the baggage of, ownership is like the more in vogue thing. What people don't hear about is the stories of, the $1 billion company that's structured as an ESOP that has a ton of workers that are buying houses with their wealth, the co-op that's been around for 200 years. And I think it's incumbent on the space, and this is part of our work, is to share these stories and to share these outcomes. And then I think from an execution standpoint, to Smith's point, one thing that's unique about A&H is we bring workers along in the journey. And so I think there's sort of this myth like, oh, you make a company employee owned And like the day you announce that, everyone jumps up and down, but they don't. They're terrified. Like you just told them the company they work at, the boss is leaving. And this is a group of people who like good things don't happen to them. So there's just a lot of trust that goes into that. And so I think that's part of the challenge is this, and it's just going to take time for people to buy in and believe. And so a lot of our work is, day in and day out, just building that trust with folks.
Yeah, since you mentioned United, and we've all heard of other ESOPs that haven't maybe been as successful as we hoped. And I think it goes back to some of what Jack said around policy, and the financing side. It's super tricky because at some level, when you do an ESOP, the owner or the founder is in some ways taking additional risk or not maximizing value, which goes against conventional norms. So can you talk through, Phil, just briefly, some of the other criticisms you've seen around ESOPs and how maybe that's just more us being naive and not really understanding the tools that we have at our disposal today?
And I think part of that is in what you just said, where like founders take a discount. I think that's not a myth, but it is. That's something that people think about in space. Like, oh, if I want to do an employee ownership transaction, I must not be getting full value. But that's not necessarily true. I think, Jack's illustrated a great point that you might not have a structure that I think is probably the best for you. And so if we can fill that gap with efforts like what we're doing and others, then what we're trying to do is put employee ownership on par with private equity or selling to strategic. And we think that by saying to you, look, you're not going to do this massive seller's note, you're going to do the same seller's note that any other private equity firm would have asked you for. We're going to pay the same price that another private equity firm would have asked you for. Then what we find, and this is like the most refreshing part, there are a lot of owners who won't transact with private equity, but they will transact with us because we can look them in the face and say, we're not going to move your business. We're not going to fire your employees. We're not even going to change the name. You can come back here in 100 years and hopefully this company will still be here. And so that's just not a promise that, traditional structures that like if you sell to private equity, they're going to sell your business in.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with, they have to, like, there's nothing wrong with that. But I think if you're the type of owner that has built this business or spending your family and it means something to you, we think we can be competitive.
I always say I'm a reformed private equity investor because I started my career in that space.
Well, I think we need to celebrate the people that do it differently as much as we celebrate the traditional private equity and traditional models. Jack, I want to dive in a little bit further. What are some of the policy challenges that you're still seeing, and what is it going to take to overcome those challenges in the foreseeable future?
Well, first I want to double click on this challenge of making sure that we have high standards of execution and transactions. And that's not to say every transaction is going to be successful, but certainly how can we avoid some of the, higher profile issues that have, been, not prevalent, but certainly have profile in the past. And so one of the approaches we took from a policy design standpoint, this EIA bill, it's the core of it is standing up a credit facility, a facility where funds would be able to access low-cost federally guaranteed debt to supplement their balance sheets to go out and do employee ownership transactions. And what we wanted to make sure at the outset is, well, if we're going to be inviting preferential capital to come into this market, we have to make sure it's playing by the rules and to have strong safeguards in place that are in the statute that make sure that we are taking some of the abuse potential out of the market. And so, that goes all the way from, basics like employees should never be putting in their own capital, rolling in 401ks, et cetera, to finance these deals. That's already best practice. It's very rare that would happen, but that is something, for example, that we prohibited. Simultaneously, if you don't have a track record of working with, either an ESOP or cooperative structure, you need to go work with somebody that has that structuring experience. So, I can get into a whole list of other protections we put in the bill, but that's all to say that that's one element of policy design. It is imperative that we use public policy to mobilize capital in ways that create social value, in this case for workers and communities. But we have to also make sure that we're doing that responsibly. I'll flag one other policy challenge that we addressed in the bill, and that is really important, I think underappreciated, is that we have a ton of great minority-owned, women-owned, veteran-owned businesses that are out there, and we have this challenge, many of whom have a federally designated status, and that gives them access to preferential contracting, and that's important to the business model. It is the case that if you are one of these designations and you decide to go majority employee ownership, you will lose that designation. And that's because, just looking into the nitty-gritty of the regulations, broad-based employee ownership in a majority context is incompatible with these. And I think inadvertently so. It's sort of, back to this mental model that Phil mentioned earlier, where ownership tends to be thought of as sort of individual entrepreneurs and not, contemplating a broad-based format. And so, our position has been that, let's use the case of a women-owned business. If you are a women-owned business and you transition to 100% ESOP, and there's still a woman CEO and the majority of the board is female directors, and if you look through the ESOP and a cumulative majority of the ownership is held by women, that is functionally a women-owned business and should be treated as such. And so part of what the bill does is to push the SVA on those regulations to make that happen. Because the upshot is that right now it is the most inclusive businesses that have this roadblock, that if they share ownership with their workforce, they'll lose this very valuable designation. So it's things like that that are pretty far into the weeds, but our role is to try to unpack that and put that into an actionable policy framework where we can move the needle to make sure that employee ownership is an opportunity that's afforded to the most inclusive of businesses that are already out there.
Thank you for highlighting that. We try to solve one thing and then we end up creating another problem that we have to get around, which shouldn't be there in the first place. So thanks for highlighting that. Smitha, I want to come back to you, and then I'm going to ask each of you kind of to take on one final question before we open it up for Q&A. There's often this notion that we have to take concessionary returns when we make these types of investments. Can you dispel that myth? And can you also weave in some thoughts around, we as investors, should we actually be trying to maximize return at the expense of others generating wealth and significant income and transforming society?
Yeah, well, it's a pretty big question, Jen, but I appreciate it. I think, the short answer is not necessarily in regards to what type of return should we be expecting, not necessarily concessionary returns. We've invested in funds like Apis and Heritage, Black Star Stability that are targeting competitive market rate returns and are trying to build the market, bring in more commercial institutional capital. They're targeting mid-teen returns, which makes sense given the asset class that they're in, the type of debt, the mezzanine debt that they're offering. And so part of it is doing a mental shift. What bucket do we put this in? What are the comps? Is it private equity and venture? Not necessarily. Is it mezzanine debt in a commercial real estate? What are the comps there? So I think part of what we're all just trying to figure out, I've had a lot of conversations with LPs, is what box do we put this in? And that's why we try not to put it in a box and more of a thematic or lens across the portfolio, because each deal does look different with different comparables. And then the other piece is that there are also certainly investment opportunities that are concessionary. And we've made those investments as well. Things like Deerfield Fund, Project Equity, that are particularly targeting a below market rate return for where they're at, something like 3 to 4%. And so when we're looking at our different deals, I think oftentimes we're just trying to understand what's the problem to be solved in the community, what's the type of ownership transition, whether it's employee ownership, home ownership, community real estate, and then we always are looking at it at Wes from an impact first mindset. So we're looking at that diligence first. And then second, we're understanding the financial model and how that fits into our overarching portfolio. I know people will have different answers around what are you trying to solve for. I think it depends on whether you're an institution, an individual, what your personal kind of goals are in regards to your portfolio. We're looking at capital preservation in the long term at Wes. And so we have a lot of flexibility in the types of investments that we make. And as I said before, in our portfolio, we're trying to basically demonstrate a variety of different models. And honestly, through this process, learn alongside our partners to say, what is the best approach to maximize impact for the communities we care about, immigrants, communities of color? we're still figuring that out. So we could certainly have another session in a couple of years when we have more data from our portfolio, because to Phil's point, these are all actually first-time funds, and Wes ends up joining oftentimes first or second closes of these funds. And so we're really trying to spark interest into these funds, give them the runway to warehouse deals and demonstrate the strategy. And the piece around, should we be asking for market rate returns? I think everyone on this screen will probably have a different answer in regards to what their personal values are.
Great. Thank you. So well said, and a nice challenge for Align to continue to push the needle on multitude of these conversations. So I want to ask everyone, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We are going to move to Q&A in a few minutes. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to answer one final question, and then we will open it up to the broader group. So Phil, I'm going to start with you. What are you most excited about in the future of shared ownership?
I think the future's bright. I mean, like I said before, I think it's early days, early innings, but it feels like there's a lot of momentum. My biggest fear is always that this moment that we're in sort of evaporates, and I think that's what worries me. A lot of times we'll hear folks in the space talk about this silver tsunami, where it's like, because of baby boomers aging, there's so many, like, trillions of dollars of assets that will change hands. And we all look at it as the greatest opportunity ever to sort of rethink, capitalism to these new models, but I think what does worry me is what happens if we miss, and we don't, we miss the opportunity. I mean, to Smith's point, if you're a homeowner and your homes go to your kids and no new homes are created, then that you've blocked everyone out. If you're a business owner and you don't transact, and it goes to private equity, there's just consolidation everywhere, and the economy just looks different. And so we have an opportunity to sort of reimagine all these things if we can take advantage of it. And I just hope that I think we will actually capture that in a meaningful way.
Great. Well, we got to band together.
Yeah.
Jack, what are you most excited about?
I am most energized by the early adopters, which are on this call. You can't get very far if you don't have investors that are willing to be first in the door, like what Smitha and Wes are doing, like what Amy Brakeman is doing, and the Align team, and to have these innovative funds like A&H and others like them. Is we have to the models have to be there for the government to even scale them up, and it will always be the case that impact investors in particular, and markets in general, will be more nimble. And so I'm excited by the innovation and the understanding that ownership needs to be part of the mental model. And I love the slide that Smitha showed earlier, because ownership is a very powerful ideal. We're talking mostly about employee ownership here, and that's certainly critical, but it's one opportunity set on a spectrum. And so what I'd like to see, and I'm excited about, is that I think ownership generally, and employee ownership specifically, is really moving into the mental model. And I think we know we will have been successful when business owners sell their business. Right now, it's a bit of this sort of exotic, different approach that you sold to your employees, right? It should be the exact opposite. It should actually, I think, generate surprise that you didn't, right? And so we have a long way to go there. But the more we can push ownership in the investment dialogue, and certainly push it in a policy context, the faster we'll get. And I'm excited by where we're going.
Smitha?
I'm also, no surprise, very excited about the momentum around shared ownership. I mean, seeing all your faces on the screen to learn more is exciting and rejuvenating for me. I think what is also interesting is that this set of tools, these are not necessarily new, but what is new is how can we redesign these tools to address the systemic racial wealth gap? And that's what I'm particularly excited about. A lot of the funds that we're looking at are bringing a very intentional racial equity lens, and we're really compelled by a lot of the opportunities in this space that are redesigning these tools that have been around for many decades.
Yeah, so well said, all three of you. And I would just echo, I think what I'm most excited about is for a new norm and for finance and the people with the power and the ownership to really shift. And I do see that as possible over the next 5 to 10 years. And I hope that Align will continue to demonstrate and lean into that and represent that as well, that it's possible in finance as much as it is, to Phil's point, in any other industry. So with that, let's open it up for Q&A. You can either type it in the chat, or you can raise your hand using the actual raise hand function in Zoom, so we can see you raising your hand, since we have multiple people on this call, and we will call on you. I do see one. Let's see if this is a question from Kareem. So I'll read it, and then maybe one of you, it'll be clear who should take it. As a business owner, it's been his experience that most employees don't understand equity and see ESOPs as another 401k type of benefit. It's nice to have, but doesn't actually change the behavior in the short and midterm. They'd rather have the cash, short-term thinking. How are you finding success with getting employees to value stock and or ownership? Phil, can I maybe have you take that question?
Sure. And it's something we think about a lot. I think in a perfect world, you'd have both. You'd have this long-term benefit in the form of ownership, and you'd have a shorter-term benefit in the form of, cash distributions. Because what we say all the time is, like, if you're an owner, if you own the business, you're going to get distributions. And so now we should share that same concept with the broad ownership group. But make no mistake, I mean, an ESOP is just a retirement account. That to get people to really buy into it takes an enormous amount of communication. Like if you look at the best ESOPs, it's the companies that communicate the best. Like we have ESOP committees at our companies. We have newsletters that talk about it. We celebrate Employee Ownership Month. When we do share release events, it's an event. All of that is designed to try to get people, even if it's in a small way, to get that what they do connects to their ownership. But it is definitely not a short process. We're in early days, so this will take years for us.
Thank you. All right, maybe and do we have any, Allie, do we have anyone that's raised their hand?
Question. I raised
Great.
Yeah, quick question. At the risk of walking back all the positivity and excitement around momentum, why do you think this hasn't been more widely adopted so far? Which you've kind of talked about a couple of reasons throughout the discussion, but I guess more succinctly, why? It seems like a no-brainer, right?
I think it seems like a no-brainer once you get your head around it, but it takes a lot of time for that. And I think a lot of the onus has been on these emerging fund managers to educate LPs and potential investors about the opportunity, not to mention the full seller market as well. And so I think there's a lot of market education. So really appreciate Align Impact's taking the lead by creating sessions like this, but we really need this to be much more mainstream because it is relatively niche. It's having a moment. It's hopefully going to evolve into more of a movement, but I think, it is still relatively low on everyone's radar. And so I think there's a lot to be done from a market education perspective. And that's why I think we're trying to write about it, be as open. When I look at the peers that I've co-invested it with across different family offices and foundations, we're constantly sharing diligence and potential investment opportunities. I think it's just so collaborative. And so really hoping to broaden the group, maybe with folks on this call of people we can share deals with and notes, because we really just need more. But I think there is this mental hurdle to get over to learn about what it is and how to invest.
I would just add to that. I think Smitha made such an important point about who's the onus on when it comes to these transactions and this field growing. And I think historically it's really been on sellers to try to put the pieces together, and even if they're lucky enough to even be aware of this, to have advisors that are knowledgeable or incented to be knowledgeable, which isn't always the case, right? And so I think there have been a lot of barriers to even get there before even look at the financing structure and arrangement. And I mentioned earlier some of those challenges. I think what's so important about this conversation and about the project of mobilizing institutional capital sources into this strategy, this impact approach, is that it is by design reducing much of that onus. I mean, imagine if in every auction process for a privately held company, there was a fund, at least one fund offering an employee ownership strategy, right? We're very, very far from that reality, and that's aspirational, but there's something to be said about capital proactively knocking on the door with expertise and structuring and so forth. And that, I think, is a massive boon to the momentum that this strategy can benefit from.
Yeah, so Jack, maybe you or Phil can share, are there any resources that investors or business owners can leverage just so they can really see how it's been done effectively, and they can use that as a guide, as well as really understanding the cost structures and the things that we tend to see as barriers? Do any references come to mind, Phil?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a few national organizations I'd point to. So the National Center for Employee Ownership, NCEO, they do a lot of work around employee ownership. Likewise, for business owners, Employee Ownership Expansion Network, which disclosure I'm on the board of, again, is helping owners understand that transition. Because I think, Kareem, to your point in the chat, it is a thing. Like, it is costly. That's been, I think, one of the structural barriers. And so that's what makes Jack's piece so important, where if you can bring in expertise to sort of sit next to you in a transaction, bring the financing, bring the expertise, it kind of creates that parity. And then on the point around great references, I recommend, if folks are curious, there's a book called there's actually a new book out by Corey Rosen from the NCEO about employee ownership, but The Great Game of Business highlights a company, I forget the name of the company, but they are, I think they're an ESOP, and it talks about how to get employees to buy into these structures.
Excellent. We had another great question. There's this myth that a company needs to be a certain size or at a certain level to do these types of transactions. Can maybe one of you take that on and dispel that, or give the ideal, like, this is where it makes sense?
Well, across our portfolio, we've looked at funds that convert businesses across all sizes. So from smaller businesses, 40 people or less with project equity, to 100 employees, 40 to 100 employees. Correct me if I'm wrong, Phil, with the A&H team, larger companies with other funds that we've been looking at, like Essential Owners Fund. So I think that across this different sizes, and even across different structures, co-ops and also EOTs and ESOPs make more sense for different size companies, different types of companies. And so that's part of the diversification that we're trying to create in our portfolio, trying to learn across these different structures what makes sense and is fit for which purpose. But to answer your question, Jen, I think you can basically structure a conversion across any size company. I think it's just making sure it's the right structure for the right company.
Great, thank you.
I also
Super
added
helpful.
more resources in the chat, and Amy is all over it as well.
Yeah, and just so everyone's aware, we want you to stay focused. The Align team will track these resources, and we'll be having a follow-up piece coming out. So we'll make sure to include them so that you can dive in deeper where you would like to. So if there are no additional questions, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to close us out with one call to action, because otherwise we've just sat here for 55 minutes and talked about how great it would be to transform society. I'd love us actually to do it. So I am going to ask you each to share your call to action and how each of us can drive this conversation forward in our work day to day. So I will start with Smitha, and then we'll go to Jack, and then we'll close it out with Phil and myself.
Thanks, Jen. And this has been such a wonderful conversation, and hope, for me, it's really fun because you're all my co-conspirators in this work. And so it's just great to be on a call together with all of you. In regards to call to action, Amy's been active in the chat, but I'm really excited to uplift something that she's been building with a few others. For those who are interested in making catalytic investments to build wealth for BIPOC households through home ownership and employee ownership, she's standing up a new fund. It's a multi-donor, donor-advised fund called Accelerate Wealth Through Ownership. They've already raised $5.5 million and are looking to pilot this fund. And so I've officially now signed on as an advisor for the fund and excited to be with my other co-conspirator, Amy, in building this out and demonstrating more models. But if folks are interested in that, we're happy to follow up with more details. We haven't formally launched it yet, but if we're happy to touch base with folks. So that's a really very near term action item that folks can take if they want to move their capital immediately to this work. The other is I would just kind of invite you to dig into some of these resources, consider all of us on this screen as also resources and extended network. If you want to touch base, I'm happy to share diligence notes, our pipeline, really open book. So let me know how I can help you get into the space.
Excellent. Jack?
Well, I will be very tactical as well. For friends that are joining from the US, I would say feel free to look up the Employee Equity Investment Act. And if you like what you see, give your member of Congress, either party, House or Senate, give them a call and say, I support this. I'm excited about employee ownership and you should support it too. You'd be surprised how, individual engagement can move the needle. This is an issue, employee ownership, where there historically has not been a lot of grassroots mobilization, not a lot of activism. It is not something that members of Congress or at the state level, for that matter, hear a lot about. And so to have constituents putting this on their radar, particularly constituents that are sophisticated and understand the financing piece or are interested in participating in these investments and so forth in any capacity, that really is how these things get done. So I would encourage everyone to put their civic engagement hat on if they're interested.
I think we should all do that. Simple, very easy one. Excellent. And Phil?
Gosh, I think it's just find a way to get involved, whether it's, becoming an LP yourself, of course, whether it's, if you're an organization that has grant dollars, trying to find a way to get grant dollars to support a lot of this work. I think obviously today we talked a lot about the investment side, but a lot of this works in an ecosystem with wraparound resources around all of these efforts. And so encourage folks to look at that. If you know a business that you think might be an opportunity to become employee owned, we're always open. And yeah, I think likewise, just stay in touch. I think you'll find, I think you can probably tell just on the call, a very collaborative ecosystem of folks who just want to help grow the movement.
Great. Well, thank you to the three of you. I will close us out with, I think we all have an ownership to drive the conversation forward and to keep it front and center. And so my call to action would be that this just isn't a moment that was expressed earlier, but this is actually the beginning of a movement that really shifts ownership and power and the collective for the good, and that it doesn't take 150 or 200 years to do so, that it looks different in one generation, if not in the next decade. So thank you to the three of you. Thank you to Allie for spearheading the Align team and this webinar. And thank you to the Align team, our clients, our friends, and the ecosystem for creating a more just world. And we look forward to continuing to partner with you. Thanks for sharing this time with us.
Thanks, Jen.
Thank you so much, everyone.